Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. It's widely accepted that America has become divided into red states and blue states. What happens to those people who are proudly liberal but find themselves living in a sea of red, environments that are overwhelmingly and sometimes aggressively conservative? My guest traveled the country to find out. He's Justin Krebs, author of Blue in a Red State, a survival guide to life in the real America. Justin, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming in. I really appreciate it. So you were one of the co-founders of an organization that is now a national organization called Drinking Liberally. This is like a title after my heart. What is Drinking Liberally?
Drinking Liberally is a national network of progressive social clubs that meet in bars, restaurants, cafes all around the country and give liberals or other interested political folks a chance to gather with like-minded, left-leaning folks and talk politics, or just talk about everyday life with people who you know share your politics. It was an idea to bring your progressive political life and your social life together.
How did this get started? And you're a co-founder. Was it your idea?
In 2003, and if we cast our mind back, that was a pretty dark time. It was the middle of the first term, exactly, of George W. Bush.
Yeah, not long after that disputed 2000 election.
Exactly, and not long after the Patriot Act passed, and and actually right around the time that the Bush administration was pushing us into the war in Iraq.
In Iraq, right.
And the
we were
Democrats
already
were going
in Afghanistan.
We'd already been there for a year and a half. And there was the sense that our world was somehow out of control and that the conservative forces had been unleashed, that those who we thought were the progressive voices were either silent or ineffective. Right. And a friend and I said, you know, here we are in New York City, and we're liberal, and our friends have time and creativity and energy, but none of them are talking politics or engaging in politics. What can we do to give people a new venue to connect around politics? We said, well, we were all in our 20s at the time. We had jobs and relationships and life in New York. We said, we can't start another organization that has membership dues and Robert's Rules of Order and serious meetings. What if we brought politics into our natural habitat? And that was bringing it to a bar. Yeah,
a bar, right, exactly. So this starts in New York City, and I mean, seems to me to be a great idea, but how did you keep it serious? How do you get a group of young people together in a bar to talk about politics and public events, current events, that sort of thing? But it's a bar. People are drinking. Not only did you keep it serious, but the organization thrived. How did you do that?
Well, we did it by building on the social capital between the people. So people came to have a drink, yes, but they weren't there for the alcohol. They were there for the conversation, and really, even more than the conversation, they were there for that sense of camaraderie, that sense that they weren't alone, that they were connecting with people who shared their values. And that's what actually made it popular beyond New York. Because in New York, you could go to any bar or any restaurant and find yourself surrounded by liberals. You might not talk politics with them, but you have a pretty good sense. But when chapters started in Idaho and in South Carolina and in Texas and in Alabama, the folks starting those chapters said, we need this. This is a lifeline to know that we're not alone, to find other people who we feel safe with to talk politics. So yes, it's in a bar. Yes, it's a fun name, and the name has always worked. But at the core of it, there's something really, really heartfelt, that desire to find a community. And that's why, in addition to Drinking Liberally happy hours, there are Laughing Liberally comedy shows and Screening Liberally films, and the overall Living Liberally project, that wherever you are, you can find people who you can connect to in ways that are both social and political at the same time.
How do you finance something like this?
On spit and dreams, I guess. It has largely run over the years on volunteer effort. There have been, every chapter has been run by volunteers. Our initial website, which was built in 2004 by a friend who was a volunteer who said, this was kind of early in the whole website phenomenon. He said, you guys need a website. We said, why do we need a website? We're just a local group that meets on Thursday nights. And he said, he was the one looking ahead. He said, you need a website because this is going to get bigger. But people just volunteered and helped bring things to the table. And honestly, in a really old-fashioned way, the chapters around the country will pass a hat and say, chip in a couple bucks so we can keep the website and the email list going, and pay the occasional legal fees, produce the buttons. But it's all, other than that, it's all been a labor of love by hundreds of people around the country.
So it's pretty easy to understand starting something like this in New York City. And as you said, there are liberals all over the place, maybe not as many as I'd like, but there are a lot of liberals around in New York City. But it takes a bit of a leap of the imagination to decide to go into conservative areas and start an organization like this. Now, it makes sense. You might need it even more in a place like that. But how did you make that leap, and how did you actually get it started?
That's a great question. And the truth is, it wasn't my imagination, and we didn't make the leap. The liberals living in conservative areas made the leap for us and pulled us along with them. So this was 2003, 4, 5, when blogs were blowing up, when social media was starting to become more of a phenomenon, and people all around the country learned about drinking liberally. They emailed us and said, we want a chapter here, we want a chapter there. So we never actually had to recruit the hosts. All we had to do was build a platform that was open enough for them to use. And I'll always remember that our first chapter was in New York, our second chapter was in San Francisco. That's pretty predictable. And then you had another chapter here or there. One was in Texas. Well, that was surprising, but it was in a big city in Texas. And then finally we had an email from Gooding, Idaho.
Look out.
And in fact, the email came and said, I'd like to start one in Gooding. We said, we don't even know where Gooding is. We had to look it up. We said, how did someone in Gooding, Idaho discover it? And that's when we knew that we had leapt beyond these blue oases.
A lot of New Yorkers don't know where Idaho is.
It's out there. No, but it's a place that has liberals that were looking to connect. They brought drinking liberally there, and then what we could do was support them.
So what happened? Did you visit these places? I mean, did you start off traveling around the country?
I always had this fantasy that I could go take a year and be a Johnny Appleseed, going around the country, seeding, drinking liberally wherever I went. But the truth is, over 5 or 10 years, anytime I'd visit any place, for a family wedding, for a conference, for a road trip, I'd make a point of finding the local Drinking Liberally chapter, introducing myself. I'm not the only one who does that, by the way. I know folks from chapters in Spartanburg, South Carolina, or some folks I know in Louisville, Kentucky. Whenever they travel, they plan their travel around Drinking Liberally chapters.
Right?
Yeah. It's, well, the same way that if you're a religious person, maybe wherever you go, you look for your church on Sunday. Well, if liberal politics is your religion, we just gave you your congregation.
There you go.
And so as I travel the country, I met these folks. And a few years ago, I did do a tour with a previous book that brought me to 35 states. And almost every one of the events was in a back room of a bar. And through those events, I really got to talk with the folks, not just in other liberal cities, not just in the Bostons or the Portland, Oregons, but in some of these more conservative towns, and hear what they were experiencing, what it meant to them to be liberal, and what it meant on an everyday basis to be liberal.
Before we get into the challenges that liberals face in conservative areas, talk a little bit about the issues that you folks were discussing when you started this organization. What were the big issues facing you that you were either upset about or concerned about or argued about?
Sure. Well, the unifying feeling when we began the organization in 2003 was that the Iraq War was an example of policy gone terribly, terribly wrong and wild,
right.
And that everything behind it, the Patriot Act, the notion that a spokesperson for the president would warn people to watch what you say because these were tough times in the war on terror, so watch what you say. It was that kind of insanity really captured our imagination. Now, there were debates from very early on. We started during the primary of 2004. So you had Howard Dean supporters and Wesley Clark supporters and John Edwards supporters and Al Sharpton supporters all coming and debating at Drinking Liberally. Interestingly, in those early days, you had very few John Kerry supporters. The more came on later on. But over the years, as I've talked to more people around the country, you get a lot of folks talking about how the economy is just out of whack, and especially after Occupy really coined the 1% and 99%. I hear
Right.
that a lot where I go. I hear a lot of people talking about money in politics, a lot of people talking about climate change, and a lot of people talking about just fundamental fights for rights, for equality, for justice. And what I found interesting and exciting is that rarely do I talk to somebody who only cares about LGBT rights, or only cares about the rights of women to have access to health care, or only cares about racial justice and what's going on with the mass incarceration in the prison system. A lot of the times the folks I speak to see the connections among all of these, see that there is a need to care for the equality and justice for a range of communities, and the realization that we're all in this together.
Well, you actually mentioned in the book that there is a core value to liberalism that is essential sort of no matter where you are. And I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you know what that core value?
The core value is that we're all better off when we live for each other than when we live only for ourselves.
Right.
Another way to say it is we're all in this together, or another way is basically the golden rule. It's not a lot more complicated than that.
I imagine you're hearing these stories from liberals in conservative areas, and you get the idea that maybe it's a good idea to do a book. How did that whole thing develop?
Whenever I would tell people that there were drinking liberally chapters in places like Utah, like great chapters in Utah, or in Alaska. I haven't visited the Alaska folks, but I know they're out there. Or Iowa. People would say to me, really? What are those liberals like? As though I'd seen a unicorn. And the fact is, on policy, on issues, on values, they're actually very similar. They have that core value that we're all better off when we live for each other. But in terms of lifestyle, in terms of what they confront on a daily basis, or even how they position themselves in their community, the culture that they put out, they are different. It is different if you're in the heartland or the deep south than if you're on the East Coast. And so as more people would ask me about these stories, I realized there was a really rich wealth of anecdotes out there. And the good folks at the New Press, who's my publisher, they agreed. And they said, if we can really tell the story and bring these voices to life, that's an interesting set of stories and memories and experiences to share.
So what are some of the challenges that these folks face? You're in a community where there are not a lot of liberals. The environment is somewhat different. In many cases, it's a very religious environment. In many cases, most of the media outlets are conservative. You have to go to work or go to school or whatever. The people you encounter, whether they're friends or not friends, are conservatives, in some cases right-wingers. What are their lives like? What were some of the stories you heard?
Well, you really came down to the right place, which is that wherever you go, whether it's to your kids' school or to your church, because many of these liberals are churchgoers around the country, or even just the local restaurant, you're confronted with things that surprise your values. The stories that I would keep hearing are Fox News is on everywhere, and that there was somebody who actually at their gym said, could we change it? Could we put on CNN instead?
Right.
And they were given the evil eye and told to back off. How dare they suggest anything other than Fox News? Or you have the folks who go to church, a place where on some fundamental level, they're finding a community that shares their values, but they're scared to talk about their whole political life. They have to leave their politics at the door.
Right.
So these folks, many of them, are making a decision, not just every day, but every hour, every interaction. How political, how liberal can I be, or how much do I need to tuck my politics in my back pocket in order to maintain the civility, just the comfort of our life. And you'll have some people who have decided that it's okay to be a little bit uncomfortable, but you have plenty of folks who say, I need to find a way to work with my coworkers who are good people, but we just disagree, and I feel uncomfortable talking about the election. So they take a sign out of their window when they park in the company parking lot. They keep their mouth shut. They don't check their blogs, or they edit what the content they put on their Facebook pages, because they don't want those colleagues or family members or people at church to know about their secret life as liberals.
You mentioned one woman who actually had two separate Facebook accounts.
As somebody who has enough trouble keeping up with one Facebook account, I found this overwhelming. She keeps two Facebook accounts, one for her political content and one, as she put it, for photos of her cats. Because she has so many family members that she was tired of having to get into fights with, that she just gives them the cat content. And this is somebody who is an active political writer, an organizer, an enthusiast. This is in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is not far from where Paul Ryan is from, if it gives you a sense of the country. But she has to now manage these two different Facebook accounts as a result. You have other people who never talk to their family at all about their political leanings. And that's the old joke. Oh, well, once a year you sit at Thanksgiving and you have your conservative uncle that you talk politics with. These are folks who maybe go to dinner every Sunday night with their family and don't talk about their politics, but also don't talk about their lifestyle, don't talk about who some of their friends or some of the places they go or some of what they read, some of their stimulus is, because they don't want to rock the boat with their families.
Some of the behavior is bizarre. I mean, you wrote about people who were had the bird flipped at them because they were driving a Prius or something like that. Or I think that there was a situation where a young person was taking a driving lesson and you had to listen to Rush Limbaugh. They had to listen to Rush Limbaugh through the entire lesson.
And felt too intimidated to turn it off. Exactly. It's true, and it's amazing how some of the stories come up again and again. The people who had Obama bumper stickers on their car getting honked at and threatened and shouted at for not because they were driving poorly, but because of what was on their car.
Right.
The people who have lawn signs, those signs you put up every election cycle, stolen, vandalized, torn up. You'd hear this not just one or two times. You'd hear it from 5 or 6 different people all around the country, and it became, in some folks, it was the kind of experience that scared them back a little bit, back into the shadows. And in other cases, they wore it as their mark of pride. They're okay, here, I'm drawing the line. I'm having my lawn, tear it down, I'm going to put up another. So.
It might sound like a silly question, but why do they stay?
It's not a silly question at all. I think there's this assumption, kind of a lazy assumption, that many of us end up moving to the areas we agree with. Because we do, in some ways, have a very geographically divided country. If you look at electoral votes during the presidential race, if you look at state houses, even if you look at neighborhood by neighborhood breakdowns of how folks vote, it's blue and it's red.
Right.
But the truth is, that just tells you what 50% plus 1 said versus 50% minus 1. So in many of these areas, there is still 20, 30, 40, 45% of the people who might agree with you, might share your values. So not everyone's moving. Not everyone is moving to New York and San Francisco and Ithaca. Now to your question of why do they stay, well, for many of them, it's their home.
Right.
For many of them, it's where their family is the same. It might be where they can find a job, might be where their aging parents live and they need to take care of them. It also might be where the cost of living works for them, where the schools work. And in some of these communities, I think of Idaho Falls. The man in my book who I've met there, terrific activist, outspoken liberal. So many things about the conservative nature of Idaho Falls rubs up against him. But fundamentally, it's a safe place to live, pretty good schools, and even the conservatives are community-minded in certain ways that make him feel like it's a great place to raise his kids.
Right.
So there are as many reasons, there are probably more reasons to stay than there are to leave. And so the key is, how do you make staying something that doesn't kill your spirit? Something where you can still be you, still find your community, still find ways to interact with the people you don't agree with, still make a vibrant sense of local civic life, and not have to flee to Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of the famously liberal enclaves that exist all around the country.
Right.
Not have to flee.
One of the things that I was not surprised about anymore, because it's been going on so long, is the level of the hostility toward Barack Obama, in some cases almost outright hatred of Obama. We know that there is a racial component to this, but it just seems to me that the levels are so high that there has to be even more than that going on. When you talk to liberals in these areas and they talk about local reaction to the president, what do they tell you? And are they disturbed by it? And do they have a sense of where it's all coming from?
There were a couple stories I heard, both in Kansas City and in Spartanburg, South Carolina, are two that I remember, where folks went to the healthcare town halls in the summer of 2010 or summer of 2009, where the Tea Party was sort of insurgent. And in both of those cases, they felt so shouted down. Not just people coming with difference of opinions, not just, okay, I get it, I'm the minority voice here, but actually hostility and even threats of violence, that they actually, in both of these cases, two people who don't know each other, both told me very similar stories,
right.
They ended up quieting down. They ended up leaving kind of concerns. So you're right, there is that hostility there. In terms of where it comes from, there is definitely a racial component, but that speaks more to a set of folks on the extreme. But I think what happens is that the people on the extreme, the people who are saying the more racist, the more truly objectionable, hostile comments, are shifting the discourse entirely, so that now the middle, the folks who are in the middle, maybe aren't paying as much attention or reading a couple newspapers, are starting to get influenced by how the extremists have influenced the discourse. So they might not say something racist about President Obama, but they start to internalize things about him not being ready for the job.
Right.
Or maybe the president shouldn't have certain powers. You're seeing it right now.
Right now.
Right now, as the Supreme Court debate is going to happen, the notion that a president who has a full year left on his term shouldn't do his constitutional duty to nominate somebody, or that his nominee should
or actually won't be permitted.
Won't be
to
permitted.
do it, is insane. It really outrageous. So you've brought us to the current political landscape, which is interesting in so many ways, most of them weird. So drinking liberally is, well, I think, but I'm not sure, primarily a young organization. Is that correct?
We're actually very intergenerational.
You are.
And city by city, it has different feels, but we have as many hosts in our 60s as we do in our 20s.
Then can I assume that there's a range of support for Hillary Clinton and for Bernie Sanders?
There's definitely a range of support. There were even a few Martin O'Malley supporters out there. But drinking...
I've never actually seen
never met one?
Martin O'Malley supporter, but I hear that.
I believe they're there. But Drinking Liberally is intentionally a non-endorsing organization because we want to be that safe space that Bernie and Hillary supporters can come to together. And they can come and debate there, or they can set aside their debates and say, you know what, at the end of the day, we're all astonished at the latest thing Trump said and appalled by Ted Cruz, and we have our Bernie camp and our Hillary camp, but at Drinking Liberally, we can mix and mingle and rub elbows again and remember we're on the same side.
Can we assume that it's safe to say that the younger members are more Bernie Sanders supporters?
I would say that across the board, there are more Bernie Sanders supporters than Hillary Clinton supporters. That's from conversations, that's from what I'm hearing people say and write. It's not from any formal polling we've done. But there is something that Bernie Sanders has tapped into that is exciting all ages of people who really proudly identify as liberal or as progressive. And I use those terms somewhat interchangeably. But people who really wear that political badge of honor are excited by what Bernie Sanders is bringing to the debate.
And what is it about Bernie that has turned so many people on? Now, I've known Senator Sanders for a long time and personally like him, and I think that he's a good guy. But I never imagined that he would have a presidential campaign that would take off to the extent that his has.
It's incredible.
What is it that's been turning so many Democrats on?
I have to say that in this case, it's the message. So 8 years ago, there was an argument of whether then Senator Obama had a powerful message of hope and of change, or himself was just such a powerful messenger.
Right.
Profoundly charismatic, exceptional communicator, exceptional life story. Well, 8 years later, when you look at Senator Sanders, you have to say, that messenger's interesting, but it's got to be the message. It's got to be someone who's actually talking about the rigged system, actually talking about inequality, actually talking about holding the bankers accountable, saying it in a no-holds-barred, authentic, no-hedging sort of way that I think is refreshing, that's exciting, that is, to be perfectly honest, further than President Obama, as exciting and inspiring as he was ever went. It is also further than Secretary Clinton, who is accomplished, is intelligent, is progressive, but is not speaking about these issues as forcefully or as out front as Senator Sanders is.
We're going to have to stop here. I wish we could go on. Justin Krebs, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me. Great talking to you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Nowadays, we see people texting everywhere, on buses and trains, while driving or walking, even in bathrooms. Recently, I saw a family in a restaurant, and each member was on his or her device virtually all through the meal. My thoughts drifted to the dinners my parents and sister and I had together many long years ago, before any of us could even have imagined a cell phone. Those were fun dinners at which we would talk about everything from the school day to politics to the greatest movies ever made, at least in our opinion. We would laugh, tell stories, sometimes argue, and commiserate with anyone who might be feeling down. I can't imagine that anything having to do with a cell phone could have been more interesting. I lost my parents many years ago. I'd give anything for just a few minutes of conversation with them again. And I'd be ready to strangle anyone who'd interrupt us with a text or an email or anything of the sort. Cell phones can be wonderful in their place, but technology is no substitute for the real deal of human contact. That's all for now. See you next time.